Oh yeah, I want every time I do anything with any events with any neuroscientists, anyone doing any research, I always put in my hand up. I did there was a fascinating one which was trying to find out what happens in the brain when people improvise. So a bunch of
Right.
people where we improvise for a living, and of course what happened was because they were all performers, they never got any good results because too many of them started wiggling around, and then a lot of the performers got so worried, even though it didn't matter the quality of your performance, others would go, "How did that person do?" And they got overly so it was an interesting bit of research, but it could never be completed due to the egos. That's what we mainly found out about ego rather than actually the material side. Now, I'm one of the things that fascinates me is, as you talk about this sense of the brain, is that we have a false sense of our agency. And that seems to be an important part to me of something, first of all, which alienates people from wanting to know about their minds.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
So you
think that?
think that people are averse to the message that they're not agents, their own individual agents, so they just shy away from it? Is this what you mean?
Yeah, I kind of
No.
feel that some people, it's not a problem for me or most of my friends, but some people want to think that they are in charge. And it feels that the further that people like you have investigated this, we find out that there's this, here we are at the very front of ourselves, at the front of our skull, where we have perhaps a delusion of leadership.
Yeah, I think I think it's there are obviously individual differences, and some people cope better if um, they don't know about this stuff. Don't bother me with this because it takes me off my route. So I really have this direction, and I don't want to be confused by reality or by real data. And some people are more inquisitive and they want to know what's happening there. And it's funny because in that regard, if you see avid or extremely religious individuals or deeply religious individuals, they also don't think usually that they are free agents, but rather, things. But in their case, the belief is that the agency comes from outside. In our case, it's just, the subconscious doing stuff for us. And it's not necessarily, it's not my original idea in that case. This is something that has been voiced before and I resonate with it and I have developed it further. But yes, the idea here is that, yes, we are the agents, but it's not the conscious we that is agent, but rather, we are, just like I said in creativity, where there's an incubation and then suddenly an epiphany, each one of your decisions is grounded in some subconscious processes. Sometimes they resonate with the conscious you and sometimes not. And in the case when they're not, you kind of fabricate an explanation for why it's hardly the case that you'll find somebody who says, I have no idea why I decided this. People can say gut feeling or whatever, and gut feeling is just another way of describing exactly this process. So something else in your brain deciding for you, and then the conscious you is finding the explanation, the best approximation, and you believe in it. It's not like we believe that we fabricate. We believe that this is the reason, because we're not privy to our subconscious processes.
Does that, do you ever feel, disappointment would be the wrong word, but that fact that some of the processes that are occurring in our brain are ones where language cannot occur? So some of, I know, inverted commas around, but the older parts of the brain, those bits. So many things that, in the book you deal with ideas of anxiety and depression, and it seems to be one of the great battles is sometimes that part of the brain, which is where the anxiety is stemming from, you can't communicate with it. We like to imagine, I'm sure many people watching this have had an experience where they're going through anxiety and their rational mind is saying, this is not going to happen. This is obviously not going to happen, but they're perhaps talking to a bit of the brain which goes, well, there's no language there.
Yes, I agree with you. And that's why that's why many of these thoughts are called obsessions, because it's really regardless of reality and regardless of common sense and rational thinking, these things continue to nag you. And I do mention a couple of approaches or strategies in the book about how to deal with it. There's no magic bullet, but for my own sake, I know that, well, it would sound very superficial, but it works for me. So if I wake up in the middle of the night and I worry about something endlessly, I'm able to bring back previous experiences, just like those that you mentioned. And it's like, I know in the morning, it's not going to worry me as much. So let's put it aside and think about it in the morning. So it's not saying to myself, don't worry about it. I'm just saying, worry about it in the morning. And then again, and then you realize that it's really not such a big deal, or it is a big deal, and you continue to worry and do something about it. But this is not really a clinical remedy, but it works for me in kind of subclinical cases.
And you also talk about that mind-body connection in the book, which is again something which, from personal experience, fascinates me. The fact that in positions, in situations of, for instance, anxiety, there can be a very physical sensation. There can be, you know, for some people it might be something like IBS, the irritable bowel syndrome, for instance, which it seems that for a lot of people that is something which comes from anxiety. That this is, and that sense, that a very tangible physical sense of danger that comes to the mind, and that mind-body connection to me is it seems that we moved away from that for a while, that we tried to separate the two, and now a lot of 21st century research seems to be bringing them back together.
You're right. Yeah, I mentioned an example where I was a very beginner. I'm still a beginner in the world of meditation and Buddhism, but in the first retreat ever, well, I started in the US with smaller retreats, but here the first silence retreat that lasted a week, I remember it's silence, but then you do get some guidance. And they talk with you about to try to sense where in your body you sense different thoughts. So thinking about your mother, thinking about your kids, thinking about your friends, thinking about money, whatever you think about, try to find this thought in your body. And this really sounded ludicrous to me. I mean, it's like, how is this possible? And I ran after the head of this organization. We're friends since then. We gave a few talks together, but I ran after him and I said, Stephen, what do you mean? How can I feel a thought in my body? And he said, it's clear that you're a neuroscientist. He knew about me before. It's like, it's clear that you're a neuroscientist. For you, and really until that moment, I would think that the body is just really carrying the brain. That's the main purpose. Not really, but that's the emphasis. So I think it's great, and many people before me have thought about this connection, and there's embodied cognition. This is one big field that's also very big in England, and yes, people realize more and more that the brain and the body are connected, and that the connection is bidirectional. That's interesting because, again, we arrogant neuroscientists think that even if the body is connected with the brain, it's one-way street where the brain instructs the body, but it actually there are many interesting theories also about emotion that talk about how the body feels first and transmits to the brain what the emotion is. So this is really counterintuitive, but it already started by William James many years ago, the father of modern psychology, that talked about this. It's called the James Lang theory, that actually the brain, if you recoil, your brain knows that you're afraid. If you're teary, then your brain knows that you're sad. So there is this, it's a two-way street. And this, I think, is a bigger revelation than just understanding that the brain instructs the body.
See, I find that just talking about that some of the fascinating research, are fascinating to me anyway, which is if you are feeling melancholy and you force yourself to smile, even though you're not feeling that, eventually that to me, that in one way, the simplicity of that, I think, is disturbing, and it won't entirely obviously cure you of your melancholy, but nevertheless, the fact that just doing that physical thing has an effect is to me.
Yeah, and you know what? If you don't mind me going on a tangent, we already talked about ADHD before. There's also a nice story here about scientific practice. So yeah, you're right. And there's a group, I think it was out of Japan, that showed this initial result, that by having people bite on a pencil in a way that made their face smile, improved their mood. So this was maybe 20 or 30 years ago. I don't remember the exact date. And this became almost common, household knowledge that you can force yourself to smile. And then more recently, maybe in the last 5 years, some group, and I'm sorry that I forget the name specifically here, but maybe in this case, it's good that I forget it, that try to replicate it, which is a scientist's biggest fear, that somebody will not replicate the result. And indeed, they didn't replicate it. And it's like, the whole thing was nonsense. We put pencils in people's mouth, exactly like they said, it didn't work. So then another group, which I really admire their persistence, actually here in Israel, in the Hebrew University, said, oh, those people that tried to replicate didn't replicate it exactly. They had a video camera inside the room looking at the subjects. Let's try to replicate the Japanese group's study with and without the camera. Just so doing it exactly the original group did it, and also like those that tried to replicate. And just the presence of the camera is what invalidated this study. So when they tried to replicate it exactly the same, without the camera in the room, they actually were able to replicate the original study. And this is indeed what you mentioned is completely legit. But adding, so think about it as scientists, when you try to do something, something as prosaic as the presence of an instrument in the room can affect how our participants feel, how they respond. So we have to be really careful.
We see now, if we really want to get tangential, we get onto quantum mechanics, obviously in the activism, but we won't go that tangential. The see that fascinates me as well, because talking about the replication problems, whenever I start reading any book which is covering some areas of psychology, I sometimes feel that sadness of the fact that so much of the 20th century experiments in psychology, we keep seeming to find out, that's kind of that experiment was a little bit more slippery than we imagined. And I would imagine that for you now in the 21st century, that problem means that you have to engage with that possibility a great deal.
Right. Yeah. Well, I try to be careful from the beginning, but there are some practices. I mean, when you're dealing with a human, of course, there are some bad apples that cause this avalanche of replication and problem, etc. Overall, it's a healthy mini revolution or revision of our methods. But we also have to be empathetic of the what was unfolded here, because when you're dealing with the human mind, this is not, you mentioned quantum physics. Even in quantum physics, the measurements are much more direct. So here you're looking at it, I look at you and I give you a problem and you solve it. I have no idea what happened in your brain. I can put you in an MRI machine. I can find a few spots of color and try to make some informative guess, but it's still a guess. When I teach my students, it can be really discouraging, because I tell them that everything we know now could be really shifting radically with something that we haven't thought about, or with a new technology. So we are still at the very beginning. And this type of a revolution of needing to replicate, and now psychological journals won't accept a paper with a single study. So when I was a student, I can publish a single study with 25 participants. Now they say, no, do this at least 3 times with different groups, with different methods. So everybody wants to be more and more careful, and I can understand this, but we also have to understand the source of those mistakes, because we're dealing with such a hard problem, and looking from the outside, trying to infer, there's no question that errors will be made.
Now, because you were just talking about not being able to go into another mind and really see and understand how they may have solved a problem, or indeed, as you kind of mentioned in the book, there is also the problem of how much can we go into our own mind, that language ends up being a model. So even the translation of what we have in here as we are talking now, we're using a model. And,
Yes.
and that seems to me, again, you talk beautifully in the book about all of these different ways that we can try and interact with our thoughts and become, you talk actually, a wonderful writer, Marion Milner, as well, a few times again. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of trying to engage with our thoughts?
Yeah, oddly enough, as you saw in the book, this struck me first in meditation retreats, not in the lab, because the prospects of observing, the first time I heard that we need to observe our thoughts, I thought it was ridiculous. How can I observe my thoughts? And then you realize that you can take different perspectives, and you can be a passenger on this train of thoughts, or you can be an observer in the station observing these thoughts. Excuse me. And this is not such a deep skill. You don't need to practice 10,000 hours before you can observe your thoughts. It's enough for you to accept that you can look at your thoughts. It's like, okay, let's examine. They like to call it visitors in the world of meditation. Let's look at the current thought, and where did it come from? How can I label it? Is it positive, negative? Is it about me? Is it about others? Is it about the past? Is it about the future? And just by acknowledging this thought, you're already not only observing it, but you're labeling it, you're giving it some kind of categorization, it can move on. And this, speaking of trying to get rid of worries, that's one way, when it's not extreme worries, that we can let go of different thoughts by acknowledging them, so rather than fighting them. So the practice of observing really came to me from presence in meditation retreats. But of course, now it is studied much more rigorously in the lab, in the language that we understand. And there again, we encounter the same issue of looking at somebody from outside, and how much can I tell about your mind wandering? I can stop you at random moments and say, what were you thinking about now? What were you thinking about now? What were you thinking about now? But you realize this is still a very artificial environment, because when you know that I'm going to ask you every 20 seconds, what are you thinking about? This already is going to taint your thinking.
You mentioned Charles Fernerhoff from Durham University in the book, and I was when I was reading your when you were talking about thoughts, something he once said about the fact that sometimes when we're surprised by our own thoughts, we must realize that not all of our thoughts are our own thoughts. Sometimes we're just listening to the noise of the machinery, and that we can, because I thought that your section on rumination was particularly important there, which is we can obsess. We can have a single thought. It was a fleeting thought, but we grabbed that thought, and then we ruminate on it, and we keep ruminating on it. And that realization, I just wondered how you feel about the idea that, some thoughts can feel more like our thoughts. Sometimes those thoughts that are alien, do you know what? They were just the sound of the machinery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I do think that they're all our thoughts, but the question is, what's their origin? And I think I gave another example from my own world of actually from dreaming. I remember waking up one morning and realizing that I had a dream where I was walking in an empty Manhattan, in the streets of Manhattan, but there was nobody there. And just when I was about to reach the end of one block, there is a giant alligator jumping at me. I mean, alligator in Manhattan with no other humans. And I really woke up startling and really scared from this. And then you realize your brain actually surprised you. So it's your own brain. Speaking of agency, right? These are my own thoughts. How can I not? I mean, you can tickle yourself, right? We know that it's us. Somebody else can tickle you, but you cannot tickle yourself. So how can I surprise myself with an alligator? So there's this interplay between your subconscious and conscious mind. And this is, I think, a best example. Of course, it's not formal. It's just my dream. But we all encounter such examples that can actually show you that there is an interplay there between processes that you're not privy to and your conscious mind, and all the way to scaring you to death, not to death, but scaring you very much.
Sorry, I've got another slight tangent, just because I'm fascinated with the crocodile dream and thinking about, it seems that for some people, a dream will stay with them for longer, that actually shaking its reality. And I've certainly seen this in older people, perhaps people who are not going to, I just wonder if there's any research in terms of the situations where for some people, the dream, maybe even 2 hours afterwards, 3 hours afterwards, maybe even the next day, it's still uncertain whether it was something that was real. It still has a certain devastation to it.
Yeah, it's not only devastation. I also feel like if I dreamt about somebody at night and then I wake up and at work or whatever, I see this person, I feel like special affinity, as if like, we had an adventure together, and then this person wasn't dreaming the same dream, and it doesn't understand why you look at them so affectionately, but actually it does stay with you, these feelings that but I'm not an expert on dreaming and the whole issue of memory consolidation and dreaming, and how much my own informal investigation of people around me is that one rule of thumb that I have is that younger people, and I don't think it's surprising, younger people remember dreams better than older people, but older people do remember dreams, and I agree with you completely. Some of it is a lingering effect that takes you throughout the day.
Sorry, I took you off on a tangent, which is nothing. It's not in the book at all, so I apologise for going there. But I was something that again I think will take people by surprise is the first sense of the idea that there is I and there is me, and that they are, to an extent, there is a separation between them. Can you tell us a little bit about where that research initially came from and where it's then gone on to take you?
Right. Well, it did start with William James, who I mentioned before. His brother Henry James, a famous poet and a writer. But William James, it's funny. Many talks in psychology start with a quotation from William James. It's as a graduate student, you can't escape him. Like he said something about everything, and he said something smart about everything. So he's the initiator of this me and I business that has been developed since. Mike Gazzaniga is a big pioneer in this field, and there are others. But the idea, and we are all familiar with these inner voices in our head, and there's almost like the good and the bad, or the person, the you that is dragging down an evil path or bad deeds or mischievous, and the other one is more the criticizer and the critic rather, and the more adult. I kind of compare it in the book to a father and a teenage girl that kind of, one of them just want to have fun and carefree, and the other is more like a stern and thinking about consequences. But they're both figments of our own imagination or subconscious mind, and it's clear there's something beneficial for this dialogue going on. But once we realize that we have these two voices, maybe we can take them less seriously or more productively.